This is what the US-Mexico border used to look like. And in many places, this is what it looks like today.
We're going to build a wall. It will get built.
I think it's just become an obsession.
But that obsession actually didn't start with Donald Trump. Why do US politicians seem so fixated on this border? And who really built all these barriers? Much of the US-Mexican border runs in straight lines. But in Texas, it suddenly gets very curvy. That's because the border runs along the Rio Grande River. Such as here, between Piedras Negras in Mexico and Eagle Pass in the US. This bridge is the official border crossing. Along the river, you see these colorful rectangles. They're shipping containers, a makeshift border wall. And those are Texas National Guard troops at the border. All that is meant to deter undocumented immigrants trying to cross the river into the US. The state of Texas took these measures. And Donald Trump is a fan.
Texas has done an amazing job.
Eagle Pass is just one extreme example on a 3,000-kilometer-long border. Elsewhere, it looks like this, or this, or this. And by the way, all US territory bordering Mexico used to be part of Mexico less than 200 years ago. But that's another story. Today, it's one of the busiest borders in the world. These are the spots to cross legally. But in recent years, millions of people have crossed the border illegally, fleeing poverty and violence in Latin America and beyond. There are a lot of stories here, of people risking their lives, of racism, of an immigration system that's overwhelmed, and ultimately of millions of people living and working in the US undocumented. And many sectors of the US economy relying on these workers. Let's just say finding political solutions is complicated. But Trump's approach seems easy.
I will end the illegal immigration crisis by closing our border and finishing the wall, most of which I've already built.
Well, not exactly. Currently, there are around 1,100 kilometers of completed border fencing. Much of Texas doesn't have any fences. One reason for that, the Rio Grande and the rugged terrain around the river serve as a natural barrier. Plus, a lot of the land in Texas is privately owned, and it's hard for the government to build a fence on it. Most of the fencing that does exist started with presidents before Trump. To figure out who built the barriers and why, we have to go all the way back to a time when Republican presidential candidates talked very differently about undocumented immigrants.
Rather than making them or talking about putting up a fence, why don't we work out some recognition of our mutual problems, make it possible for them to come here legally with a work permit?
Here's Mary E. Mendoza, a historian of the US-Mexico borderlands.
And it is a complete 180 from what you see Republicans talk about today. Republicans are like, they're horrible, they're criminals.
As president, Ronald Reagan signed a bill that gave roughly 3 million undocumented people in the country legal status. That was actually the last time there was a major immigration reform in the US.
But with that, it was like, okay, now we can really reinforce the border so that we don't create this problem again, right? To have the undocumented people.
That's Iracema Coronado, the director of the School of Transborder Studies. She grew up in Arizona, right at the border.
So they started to militarize the border.
That militarization was a bipartisan effort, but more on that later. Let's first stay with the Republicans and what happened at the border after the major turning point in recent US history, 9/11.
That changed the world. That changed the US-Mexico border, absolutely. Even though the terrorists did not come from Mexico. The United States has never been attacked that way. And the idea that other terrorists would come through the southern border to inflict harm on the United States was real.
Thank you. Please be seated.
So President George W. Bush took action.
Pleased that you all are here. We have a responsibility to secure our borders.
In 2006, Bush signed the Secure Fence Act. And by the way, the act was supported by Democrats in Congress, including some familiar faces. Bush's Secure Fence Act ultimately doubled the number of Border Patrol agents and called for more than 1,000 kilometers of fencing at the southern border. But the US fence building had actually started long before. And the Democrats played quite a role in that. Let's head to a place called Friendship Park. It's right at the border of San Diego, California in the US and Tijuana in Mexico. Pat Nixon, the wife of Republican President Richard Nixon, opened the park in 1971 and greeted Mexicans across the border, a gesture of friendship between the two countries. And this is what the First Lady reportedly declared: "I hope there won't be a fence for too long." But her hope was misplaced. This is what Friendship Park looks like today. The US side of the park is closed off with these two border fences. How did this happen? In 1993, far more undocumented immigrants were registered in the San Diego sector than in any other area along the border. There was a radical change in tone in how even average people talked about immigrants.
Our country is invaded by immigrants who are like cancer cells.
Bill Clinton, a Democrat, was the president at the time. He decided a fortified fence was the solution, from the Pacific Ocean right through Friendship Park. This is what the barriers looked like. They are helicopter landing mats left over from the Vietnam War. Clinton launched the construction of 3 major fence projects around these urban areas in the 1990s, in California, Arizona, and Texas.
One of the cornerstones of our fight against illegal immigration has been a get tough policy at our borders.
Along with the fences came increased surveillance technology and more Border Patrol agents. Clinton's fences came at the same time as the North American Free Trade Agreement between the US, Canada, and Mexico. The message was clear: more access for goods, less access for people. But the people kept coming anyway. And because Clinton focused on urban areas, immigrants tried crossing in more remote regions.
This is where we start talking about the funnel effect. It funneled people to the most dangerous locations along the US-Mexico border. And so people began going to mountainous desert landscapes to cross the border, and death rates along the border skyrocketed in the 1990s. And they have been climbing since.
That hasn't stopped one US president after another from spending billions of dollars on more barriers and more surveillance. As we've learned, Bill Clinton laid the groundwork for George W. Bush. Post 9/11, Bush built around 800 kilometers, resulting in the biggest amount of new fencing by any president. Then Barack Obama continued to build, adding around 200 kilometers. By the way, some immigration experts called him
the deporter-in-chief,
because he deported hundreds of thousands of people. And Donald Trump only built around 130 kilometers of new barriers. But he replaced a lot of the existing barriers along the border. Joe Biden campaigned on being different than Trump when he ran for president.
I don't believe for a second we're the nation that builds walls and whips up hysteria over immigration.
Back over in Friendship Park, Mexican artists painted this mural recently. It shows what they think. US presidents embrace the same methods at the border, despite their different rhetoric. And in 2023, it was Joe Biden's turn to order further work on the barrier here. So, to our question of which president built all this, the answer is kind of all of them in recent decades. Both Democrats and Republicans.
A lot of times they just build over each other's fences.
So why is there this fixation on building border fences? Well, politicians can show that they are doing something about the issues playing out at the border.
They're using that for their political gain. I think that politically right now, because people don't want to understand the complexity of the issue and they want an easy fix, that everyone has to be hard on the border.
But walls and fences don't solve the issues which lead people to keep on migrating.
We're stuck in a repetitive pattern of failure where we make a policy that doesn't quite work, so we build a fence or a wall, and that doesn't really do anything either. So we go back and we try to pass some kind of law or make another policy, and that doesn't really do anything. So we build a wall.
Democrats and Republicans haven't been able to pass a major immigration reform since the 80s. It's not like they haven't tried. But partisan politics and election campaigns keep getting in the way. The only thing both sides seem to agree on is building more barriers. That's why the story of the US-Mexico border barrier is not over. And whoever wins the next US presidential election, he or she will probably keep building it.